how do you describe the effects of the brutal business known as war? In this year of 2023, all one has to do is examine the images we can see most days from the Ukraine. But over a century ago, American Civil War Union General William Tecumseh Sherman described war in words, both succinctly and accurately, I would suggest, when he noted, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." He summed up his feelings in 3 words, saying, "War is hell." When studying the outcome of a military battle, yes, it's usually important to know which side won and how the victory was achieved, but let us not forget the human cost, not only for civilians who found themselves in harm's way, but for those who took part in the battle itself. On this very site, 209 years ago today, a major battle took place between British regulars, their indigenous allies, and members of the local militia on one side, versus American regulars and their indigenous allies on the other. The battle was relatively brief, but bloody. The outcome was an American victory. However, at its conclusion, hundreds of men had been killed or wounded, both in this open area before us, referred to as a plain at the time, as well as the adjacent woods where vicious fighting had also taken place. As one military historian has noted, quote, "The casualty figures for Chippawa spoke of a new, terrible efficiency in the fighting." Canadian historian Donald Graves described the scene here following the battle this way, and I invite you to visualize this in your mind. On the plain and in the woods around it lay hundreds of wounded, dying, and dead men, sprawled where they had fallen. The dead were buried here on the battleground. Stretcher bearers collected the wounded. Many of them were taken to a nearby home owned by Mary and John Usher. Darkness fell before all the wounded could be reached. Consequently, many died during the night while lying in agony on the field of battle. One observer who was on guard duty that night later recalled how the groans of the living were shocking. In the village of Chippawa, virtually every house was filled with wounded. Their groans reverberated throughout the little community. Within a few days, many of the British wounded were taken to Fort George in present-day Niagara-on-the-Lake. As was often the case during the War of 1812, the surgeons there were greatly overworked, trying to look after so many wounded. One of those wounded later recalled, and I'm quoting, "The scene at Fort George was most distressing. It was painful to witness the distress and agony of the wounded, having their legs or arms amputated, some balls extracted from their wounds, and others splinters of bones." Related to those recollections are the observations of Dr. William Dunlop, a British Army surgeon during the War of 1812, who tended to many wounded soldiers following the Battle of Lundy's Lane, fought 20 days after the Battle of Chippawa. Dunlop wrote, "There is hardly on the face of the earth a less enviable situation than that of an army surgeon after a battle. Worn out and fatigued in body and mind, surrounded by suffering, pain, and misery, much of which he knows it is not in his power to heal. While the battle lasts, all these pass unnoticed, but they come before the medical man afterwards in all their sorrow and horror. It would be a useful lesson to cold-blooded politicians to witness such a scene, if only for 1 hour." Echoing these sentiments a few years later was General William Tecumseh Sherman, the individual we quoted earlier. The general noted, "It is only those who have never fired a shot nor heard the shrieks and groans of the wounded, who cry aloud for more blood, more vengeance, more destruction. And so this evening, we pause and reflect on the Battle of Chippawa and its role in the War of 1812. We recall the outcome of the battle and honor those many whose lives ended violently, agonizingly, as a result of taking part in the conflict. We remember the human side of the battle, and especially the human cost.